Hey, this is Pablo with Meditation Amsterdam, and in this very short clip, I want to clarify something that has been playing in my mind for some time, and which seems to be because of our dependence on words and semantics, a point of confusion that tends to get people into kidding themselves into thinking that they've become enlightened or that they're becoming very spiritual or that they're on the right path when in fact they're just in some sort of mental circle jerk chasing their own tail. And that is the concept of ego and the popular or colloquial use that is given versus the use that it is given in the context of self-realization. And I wanted to make that distinction as clear as possible because in understanding that distinction, you are able to work with the real objective of the word as mentioned in Buddhist or well, in the Buddhist text you don't really hear the word ego, but there's a reference to this and is often translated as ego. So if you understand this correctly, you would be able to notice it when it's coming up, and you are able to work with it. If you don't know the correct meaning of this, you are essentially kind of kidding yourself, and you've yet found just another way for the ego in spiritual terms to keep playing, to keep playing up. It hasn't vanished, it just took a different shape, so to speak, right? So maybe to illustrate that, we can take the classic example of people who, when coming across a new spiritual discipline such as meditation, yoga practices, Tai Chi, they acquire a certain persona. And this has been coined lately as spiritual materialism, which is to say that they've essentially, maybe they were very business oriented or very sort of shrewd and logical or whatever, but suddenly they find that there's this space called spirituality in which you get to practice certain things, and maybe you try to embody a more kind and more empathic attitude and gratitude and things of this kind. So all these practices and observances, and maybe even austerity. So you withdraw away from certain pleasures or addictions, and they build a new persona around this, yeah. And they think that by building this new persona, who you see them in yoga studios, they talk really softly, and when they hug each other, they just hug a little bit longer than normal people do, right? And so there's this whole sort of spiritual vibe to the whole thing, right? And so it's kind of, maybe it's a useful scaffolding to kind of slip into this kind of sort of more spiritual mode and away from these other things. But as far as strict self-realization or awakening and enlightenment are concerned, you have not moved an inch, really absolutely nothing, zero progress when it comes to getting closer to, quote unquote, the goal of awakening, because you've essentially substituted one persona for another, right? And so you've realized nothing. Now, granted, that new persona might be exercising things and doing practices and observances and austerities and attitudes, kindling attitudes, and maybe even kindling company, as in like the people you surround yourself with, that is much more likely to lead you to self-realization. But in terms of actual self-realization, you haven't moved an inch, absolutely nothing. And so in order to understand this, it's good to make the distinction of ego as used in the normal colloquial sense of the term, and ego as used in the self-realization sense of the word. So in the normal sense of when speaking in a day-to-day vernacular, you use ego, or when you say somebody has a big ego or somebody is egoic or egotistic, what you're trying to refer to is a person that is typically very self-centered, somebody that is selfish, that is always looking out for number one, right? But you are also typically referring to someone who has a fairly big and misguided sense of themselves in the sense that, if they have a big job or a big car or a beautiful partner or whatever, or they're very popular in some kind of sense, or maybe even very capable at a certain thing, you say, oh yeah, he or she is all full of themselves. They're all full of them. Oh, he's full of themselves. He has a big ego, really huge egos, right? Or, typical like big boss in a company. Oh yeah, the guy's got a huge ego. He, talks people down or likes to hear himself talking. Look who's talking, right? Just like to hears his or herself talking all the time. Values his opinion way above everybody else. Doesn't really listen, or just has a big head because of all these superficial things that they got going on for themselves, and it props them up, so to speak. So a big ego is somebody who's standing on top of something superficial, such as good looks, good fortune, good talents or certain life situation or good social status, and they're standing on top of these things, and because of this they are acting big, and that's what we consider somebody who has a big ego. Now, in spiritual terms, the ego is never big or small. It just is or isn't. And what you have is degrees of identification with it. So, in spiritual terms, or in terms of self-realization, there is either the egoic mind or the higher self. And there's really nothing in between, and only degrees of how much you identify with either of them. Now, the higher self, right? The one that is totally devoid of ego insofar as it can be while you are inhabiting a human body or a human body mind system, so to speak, is when you are entirely operating from and 100% identified with the inner heart of awareness, that inner kernel within you that is shapeless and timeless and ever present. And it is pure conscious awareness, right? So that's as good as it gets when it comes to as long as you're in a human embodiment, so to speak. So you are pure conscious awareness, totally devoid of memory of being a human being or identification with I'm a man or a woman, or where you come from, what is your history, memory of this and that, or trying to conceptualize things, you name it. That is purely devoid of ego. So now you are in the higher self. Everything else, the moment you start giving things names, the moment you start saying I prefer this versus that, that means that I am a self who has a preference. Whereas the pure consciousness has no preferences. It just observes everything precisely as it is. It's like a crystal ball or a mirror that simply reflects whatever it's put next to. It's colorless. It's completely transparent to experience, right? So anything other than that is egoic as far as spirituality is concerned. So that even if you were Mother Teresa, so long as she considers herself a good person, woman, those are three elements that are already egoic as far as spiritual maturity is concerned, because the mind has wrapped itself around these things, whereas in reality, non-ego would be the pure conscious awareness that can observe the fact that she is a woman, or observe the fact that she is good, or observe the fact that she is a human being, right? So, so long as you're playing on the colloquial side of things, you could become the very best person in the world and still be 100% egoic and 0% self-realized from the spiritual perspective. Because from the spiritual perspective, you're trying to move away from observable, definable things and towards the thing that observes them without definition, without preference, which is pure conscious awareness that has no, well, it has no dimensions, it has no preference. It is everything, and it is sort of timeless, so to speak. I don't want to say eternal, because then you get into these sort of I don't know, religious terms of God being eternal or whatever. But this, what we call God consciousness, or as close as we can get to that, is our inner kernel of conscious awareness that can observe our attitudes, our preferences, our personal, history or whatever, and that even if we become non-egoic in the eyes of society, it is really internal work that matters. I just read a quote today that I thought was very interesting in that sense, which says, if you take an egg, any pressure that breaks it from the outside, kills the life inside, but the pressure that comes from the inside means that new life is born. And with spirituality, that's the same thing. It is not what we consider egoic in the way we conduct ourselves and what we do, what we think, how we feel about it. It is, have you the ability to identify yourself with the inner kernel of conscious awareness that can observe all these things, whether they're good or bad. And once you understand ego in those terms, then you have a better sense of what it is that you're aiming for. And you have a better sense of, the fact that you conduct yourself in a very kind or spiritual way has absolutely zero to do with whether you're getting close to self-realization or not. So I hope that clarification works. And I'll come back with more videos as usual. Cheers.